will wage the war on terror against every enemy who plots against our forces and our people.
Our goal is to defend the American people.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
Definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the side.
Those could be cargo planes, but the upper floors of the World Trade Center in Manhattan in flames now.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
Jihad becomes religious obligation of all Muslims.
God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
That was not American Airlines! That was not American Airlines!
The plane was a larger plane.
Stretch, big stretch. I'm
Sorry,
sorry.
Mr. President. I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And, it's an absurd insinuation.
Okay, sir, can I follow up on something unrelated?
I have a message for our military. Be ready. I've called the armed forces to alert, and there is a reason. The hour is coming when America will act, and you will make us proud.
At 8:46 on the morning of September 11th, 2001, the world would forever be changed, and America would forever be altered. A wave of patriotism swept across our country, and the drumbeat of war was heard from our nation's heartland to countries a half a world away. With a war on terror declared, a nation would find itself in an uphill battle that would eventually lead to the destruction of civil liberties and the establishment of a military driven to conflicts based upon political lies and fraudulent official reports. We now begin our investigation into the events of September 11th. What were you told happened that day?
There are some very anguish-ridden people in the world, and they decided to attack us.
2 planes were hijacked by terrorists, and they were crashed into the World Trade Center.
2 planes flew into 2 skyscrapers and destroyed them.
Part of the building was just smashed in and had been burnt, and just chaos.
From all the film footage that I've seen in the past 6 years, there was 2 commuter jets.
My initial reaction to September the 11th was that it was as advertised, that these aircraft had been hijacked, that it was a big terrorist operation, that we were attacked by Muslim extremists. I kind of just believed the initial story. Was in a state of shock. As reports came out through the news and some alternative news sources that I had been subscribing to, there were some things that were reported by credible people at these accident sites that did not agree with my professional training and my background.
Very strong. Boom! An explosion so hard that pushed us upwards.
He was the last guy pulled out. He was on sub-level 2, and he heard a bomb. And he was omitted from the 9/11 report.
I've looked at various hypotheses about what might have happened with the plane hits on the World Trade Center, and frankly, I haven't come to a firm conclusion. I do think that some of the pod images are suggestive of the possibility of a plane switch. I'm not convinced that that's the case, however.
There was definitely a blue logo. It was like a circular logo on the front of the plane, towards the definitely towards the front. It definitely did not look like a commercial plane.
The plane wasn't no airline or anything. It was a twin-engine, big gray plane.
When I first saw the appendage on Flight 175, this extra piece of equipment, I was looking at the Evan Fairbanks footage, which is kind of bluish, and it's from the underneath. It's off-centered on the fuselage. It's between the engines. It casts its own shadow. It has its own reflection. And when I saw this, I thought somebody's had to have photoshopped this, and I wanted to get other sources to make sure that it wasn't just a product of Photoshop. It was in all the CNN footage when you took their videos and did freeze frames. It was definitely a three-dimensional piece of equipment. It definitely has nothing to do with Photoshop, and it shouldn't be there.
Anybody can see the other piece of equipment right there in the center line on the starboard side of that fuselage. It can't be anything other than an external piece of equipment.
Looking for more video evidence, right at ground zero, Deb Simon and I went down to New York City one day and buying all the pictures from street vendors we could find, we found a picture which I believe is Rob Howard's photograph, but it was a 35mm print. And I was tickled because you could clearly see, the appendage on the bottom. This is not normal for an aircraft. This is not normal for what we should be seeing on Flight 175.
All the recorded sources, all the different photographic evidence that was produced by CNN and ABC, they all show this pod. It's there. You can see it with your own eyes. And in my professional opinion, that there was a pod attached to the bottom of that aircraft, and therefore it was not United Airlines Flight 175.
I've never seen the pictures that it's shown the things attached to the bottom of the plane, so I mean, if it's a commercial airliner, I don't understand why they would have anything attached to the bottom of the plane. That doesn't seem to make any sense.
One of the things that jumped out at me when I looked at the footage of the video of Flight 175 as it went into the World Trade Center is it appeared to me that there was something on the under fuselage of that aircraft that did not belong there, at least not with a commercial airliner. Now, I'll tell you where I have seen attachments that look like that on military aircraft. So the question you have to answer now is, was that the commercial airliner that hit the World Trade Center, or possibly was it an aircraft that looked very similar but was a military type airplane?
After compiling a lot of the photographs and a lot of video regarding Flight 175, and there's some CNN footage that shows the whole side of the plane lighting up. And just as the aircraft is penetrating the World Trade Center, there's this bright anomalous event. It's like an orange flash, off to the right of the fuselage.
The bottom of that aircraft was exposed so that there was a large flash just prior to impact with the building. There was a large flash, so large that it lit up the side of the fuselage of that aircraft. It wasn't just a small spark.
There's been some discussion of just exactly what produced this flash. Some of the scenarios have been talked about have been reflection, or sparks, or static discharge, or possibly an incendiary attached to the aircraft. This flash is produced in the shadow of the wing, so I don't think it could have been a reflection. As far as the possibility of sparks during penetration, the radome of the aircraft is a composite material. It's not metal per se. The wings are metal. They didn't produce sparks as they penetrated, so I don't believe they were sparks. As far as the static discharge, the 767 all aircraft have attached to the airframe what's called static wicks that are there to dissipate any static charges that could be produced on an aircraft in flight. In all my years of flying, the only time an aircraft has been statically charged is when you're flying for extended periods in precipitation. September the 11th was a perfectly clear early fall day without any clouds in the sky, so I don't think these aircraft would have been statically charged by precipitation. And the other item, or possible explanation, would have been an incendiary. And I do believe that this is what the source of the flash was. This flash is produced right in line where the pod was attached. Look at the footage in very slow motion. You can step through the footage with your pause still button on a DVD, and as this aircraft penetrates, you see the enlarged, torn area, facade where this pod was attached. All this evidence indicates to me that it was not a reflection or sparks or static discharge, but I think it was an incendiary that was associated with the pod that was attached.
Well, the pod could have been a number of things. It could have been even a missile attached. It could have been some kind of explosive attached. But whatever it was, it didn't belong there on a commercial flight.
This is a rocket pod. We primarily use these to shoot 2.75-inch unguided rockets. On the A-10, the primary role that we use these rockets for is forward air control. We shoot white phosphorus rockets that contain a phosphorus spotting charge. A very brilliant white cloud of smoke comes up when the rocket hits.
American Flight 11 was the flight that hit the North Tower, the first tower that was hit. And as far as we know, it was recorded by just one source, and that was the Nade brothers, who were producing a documentary video about New York firefighters. They happened to be in a position to catch American Flight 11 as it overflew New York City and flew into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Again, as you look at this footage, slow it down just a little bit, you can see this a big flash before this airplane even hits the North Tower, and I would say quite probably that it was also an incendiary that caused that flash.
Pods under the plane suggesting they might be some sort of military plane, and flashes suggesting that they might be igniting large fireballs for spectacular television effect. Personally, I'm not convinced that that's true, but I'm also I'm not convinced that we need to dismiss that hypothesis. I've looked at these images, and some of the pod images, I think, they don't look to me like just optical illusions like the people who've debunked this claim.
Did the pod have anything to do with the flash? I can't answer it, but I can say this. The pod you will not find, or an external piece of equipment that large, you will not find on the belly or attached anywhere on the external part of a Part 121 scheduled airliner in the United States. It just won't happen. All that does is tell me that airplane was not the airplane that the government said it was.
I have looked at the films of the plane hitting the South Tower, and I have seen the slowed down version, and it is obvious to me that on more than 2 or 3 of these films there is a flash of some sort that takes place just as these planes are about to smack into the buildings. I cannot tell you what that is, but I can tell you what it's not. It's not a box cutter.
Indeed, the flash couldn't have been the result of a box cutter. So if the flash was the result of an incendiary device, how does that fit into a terrorist hijacking scenario at all? And if, as Colonel Nelson has proposed, there was extra equipment attached to the belly of the plane that hit the South Tower, how could that have been United Airlines Flight 175 or any other commercial airliner for that matter? Keep in mind that these planes disappeared for nearly a half an hour, surely enough time to substitute a drone in place of commercial aircraft, as was proposed in the 1962 Northwoods document.
One of the scenarios in Operation Northwoods was to take a regularly scheduled commercial airliner and take a similar type plane, paint the tail numbers up to resemble that of the commercial airliner, fly it by remote control out over the Caribbean, and by remote control blow it up after sending a tape recorded message saying, "Help, we're being attacked by Cuban MiGs." This was in 1962. I think we had a very sophisticated, more modern version of that plan happen on September the 11th, 2001.
Tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
The way those buildings were constructed, the supporting members essentially melted. And once that occurred, then the buildings started to come down like pancaking, with more and more weight being put on each lower floor, so then the whole building came down.
Structural damage to the buildings is what I heard on television.
There's never been a modern steel concrete building that's ever collapsed due to fire. Not before, not after.
My testimony was very upsetting for the commission for the simple reason that, number one, I talk about explosions in the building, initial explosions before the plane hit the building. I spoke about seeing one of the hijackers, alleged hijackers, 3 months before 9/11. I told them that I had told the FBI this information, and I kept quiet for 2.5 years, thinking that there was an investigation, a formal investigation by the FBI, and then I realized it was just not going anywhere. There was nothing being done by this investigation, not talking about the 9/11 Commission, but the FBI investigation itself.
William Rodriguez was a maintenance worker for the World Trade Center for 20 years, and he's traveled the world telling the story about what happened to him on that horrible day. His testimony is one of the most heart-wrenching and emotional that you will ever hear. It is his testimony that was deleted from the 9/11 Commission report. Here's one of the reasons why.
Very strong. Boom! An explosion so hard that pushed us upwards. Upwards. And at that moment, I thought it was the mechanical room where they have all the pumps and the generators for the building, that maybe a generator just blew up on the basement. Now, 20 years in the building, you know something that comes from the bottom and something that comes from the top. And when I went to verbalize that it was a generator, we hear, boom, all the way on the top. The impact of the plane on the top. Two different events, two different times.
His testimony of an explosion below him, just seconds before the plane hit in the upper floors, would obviously destroy the official story of a simple hijacking. But the mainstream media has no interest in telling his story honestly. He was interviewed on September 11th of 2006 in New York City. And listen carefully as to how WABC-TV edited his story to make it sound as though he was describing the sound of the plane and not a basement explosion.
Rodriguez worked at the North Tower. He was a custodian responsible for cleaning the stairwell. On the morning of 9/11, he was in the basement.
We hear, boom! An explosion so loud that pushed us upwards on the air. And we started screaming. We didn't know what it was.
It was the first hijacked plane that hit the tower.
Is it possible that WABC and other network affiliates were working from a script on the morning of September 11th, 2001? Let's take a look at some of the other video clips from other media outlets. And these were shot as the events unfolded that morning, long before any scripts could have been handed out.
Tell me where you were, what happened, what did you see, what did you hear?
First, I went on Canal Street. I saw the fire. I saw the two buildings. I'm thinking it was a bomb because two of them.
Again, there has been a second explosion here in Manhattan.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it, came down, sending smoke and debris everywhere.
We're being pushed out as well because there was some concern that there might be additional explosions, possibly other bombs.
I need you to stop for a second. There has just been a huge explosion.
And then the entire top of the building just blew up.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. And it was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on a mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it. Just everything went flying right in front of me. Everything just went boom.
Tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
They could very well have set off set charges within the World Trade Center, and of course it went down just like many of the buildings that we've seen on CNN or Fox TV, the Bush Stadium in St. Louis, or one of the famous hotels out in Las Vegas. It just crumbles, it just implodes, and it falls in upon itself. And that's really, I remember on that particular day watching that on the TV monitor and saying to myself, hey, that looks really strange the way it's coming down. I don't think it's necessarily from the plane and the fire from the plane that's doing this.
It almost looks like one of those implosions of buildings that you see, except there is nothing controlled about this.
We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
Plans to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running.
I was making my way to the foot of the World Trade Center. Suddenly, while talking to an officer who was questioning me about my press credentials, we heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
And then the entire top of the building just blew up, and splinters of debris are falling on the street.
Oh my God!
When I began to look at the destruction of the World Trade Center and especially the Twin Towers, it was astonishing to me how obvious the evidence was that the government account couldn't possibly be correct. Of course, the government maintains that the buildings came down as a result of the impact of jet aircraft resulting jet fuel fires, which weakened or melted the steel and led to a pancake collapse. That's indefensible on every count. The buildings were designed to withstand the impact of the then largest commercial airliners, which were Boeing 707s, very similar in their size and mass and fuel capacity to the 767s that actually hit the building. Most of the fuel from these planes burned up in spectacular fireballs. The fires that resulted were relatively modest. The melting point of steel turns out to be 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The highest temperature you can acquire with a jet fuel-based fire, which is principally kerosene incidentally, is 1,000 degrees lower under ideal circumstances. The billowing black clouds indicated these were oxygen-starved or deprived fires that were burning much lower temperatures. In fact, the estimates on all sides are those fires were only running about 500 degrees Fahrenheit, much too low, obviously, for the steel to have melted or even to have weakened, since Underwriter's Laboratory had certified the steel up to 2,000 degrees for 3 to 4 hours. The fire in the South Tower burned only around an hour, in the North an hour and a half, so the fires were too low and too brief in duration to have caused the steel to even weaken. If the steel had weakened, there would have been asymmetrical sagging, it would have been gradual, and you wouldn't have had enough dynamic energy to cause a collapse in any case. The whole theory of a pancake collapse is a physical impossibility.
Molten metal in the basements of all three buildings.
Right.
And yet all scientists now reasonably agree that the fires were not sufficiently hot to melt the steel. So what is this molten metal? It's a direct evidence for the use of high temperature explosives such as thermite. Thermite produces molten iron as an end product.
Okay. We appreciate your coming on, even if I don't understand your theories. We appreciate you trying to explain them. Thanks.
These core columns were discovered after the collapse. The angled cut occurs in exactly the manner that shaped charges slice through steel beams to control the way they fall. Notice the hardened, once liquid metal. Was thermite used with the shaped charge?
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which through a series of beams cut at the same angle will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
Building 7, I'm not familiar with what it looks like or where it is.
That's where the command center was. I don't know that much about the structural issues on that building, other than that an intense fire occurred there as a result of debris and such coming from the towers, and that's why that building came down.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
One of the keys to what happened on 9/11 is what caused Building 7 of the World Trade Center to collapse. Many of you are going to go, Building 7, what was that? That was a 47-story steel and glass office building that just totally collapsed down into its own foundation about 5:20 on the afternoon of 9/11. It was not hit by airplanes, didn't have any devastating fires in it. It just collapsed down after the building owner, Larry Silverstein, said, well, I told the fire department to pull it, and they pulled it, and we stood there and watched the building come down.
And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Well, industry slang, pulling it means controlled demolition. If Building 7 was brought down by controlled demolition, then why is it so preposterous to assume that perhaps the Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition?
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down soon. It'll be coming down soon.
What we know for sure is that these buildings were pre-wired for demolition, and that the plane hits were simply created as a distraction in the way a magician distracts you by showing you one thing while pulling something out of a hat while you're not looking. In the same way, they conditioned us to think that the demolitions were actually collapses caused by plane hits and fires, when we now know that they were not. Building 7, which is obviously a controlled demolition, the collapse of this 47-story building in 7 seconds, for no reason at all, a couple of small fires and a couple of little nicks on the side of the towers. That's a ridiculous story that anybody can see through. And then when you hear that the overinsured landlord of 6 weeks, Mr. Larry Silverstein, basically confessed to pulling it or taking it down in a controlled demolition on national television, no less. I mean, you really see that the whole thing is obviously an inside job. So I think Building 7 is sort of the first thing that we need to wave in the face of everybody who hasn't figured this out yet.
On September 11th, there was worldwide live television coverage, and the coverage continued throughout the day. The interesting thing is that at 10 p.m. London time, which is 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, they reported that the Salomon Brothers building, Building 7, had collapsed. The only problem is Building 7 didn't collapse until 5:20 p.m. New York time.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center...
Building 7 is clearly visible right behind the reporter. It wasn't until 5:20 Eastern Time that it came down. Buildings 4, 5, and 6 maintained heavy damage from falling debris from the towers, and yet they remained standing. In Madrid, Spain, this building burned for nearly 24 hours, a raging inferno, and it didn't fall. Building 7 received minimal damage and suffered only a minor fire, and yet it collapsed. The collapse of a concrete and steel structure due to a fire had never happened before September 11th. So how did the BBC know ahead of time that it was to come down, unless the cover story that had been prepared for public consumption had been released, in this case, a little too early? I don't think that there's any disagreement in the 9/11 research community that one of the strongest arguments that challenges the official story is the issue of controlled demolitions. There are multiple video angles, there are photographs, there's witness testimony explaining that there were bombs and explosions going off in and around the Trade Center. There's scientific data, all supporting the charge that these buildings were brought down by demolition charges. Well, if that's the case, we have to ask the question, what role did the planes play? There are those out there that get very upset when we talk about pods or flashes or substituted planes. Well, if these planes were indeed hijacked, that would mean that the hijackers would either have to be A, in collusion with those that had placed the charges in the North Tower, the South Tower, and in Building 7, one of the most secure buildings in New York City, if not the most secure building. Well, if it couldn't have been collusion, well, the only other option is coincidence. The hijackers just happened to fly the planes into buildings that were scheduled to be demolished just minutes later. Well, if it can't be collusion and it can't be coincidence, then how could it have been terrorists? All of a sudden, the concept of flashes and pods and substituted planes becomes more plausible, and it doesn't conflict with the idea of controlled demolitions, but in fact supports the contention that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolitions. The countless reports of bombs and explosions going off in and around the World Trade Center were completely ignored by the 9/11 Commission and downplayed by the mainstream media. William Rodriguez's testimony before the 9/11 Commission was completely deleted, or shall I say, censored. Why is there such an effort to suppress information and evidence that might challenge the official story? Why do government officials and the media consistently try to ridicule or discredit those that would be in the best position to shed light on these irrefutable facts? Let's take a look now at what happened at the Pentagon and see if the same methodology has come to play.
No, I didn't. I just saw the aftermath of it, like the destruction of the building.
A less reinforced part of the Pentagon structure was the part that was hit by a fully fueled plane at a speed and at a point in the structure that was able to cause massive fire and explosion and thus take out that large swatch of the Pentagon that we all saw on the news.
A white plane, a very big jet, was flying an unusual pattern near the White House over Lafayette Park very slowly. It made one circle and then we have not seen it since.
The official story of Flight 77 tells us that this plane waltzed all over the eastern United States and turned around over Ohio at 30,000 feet, came back and hit the Pentagon at 9:37 in the morning. This was after at 8:46 the World Trade Center had been hit, virtually almost an hour after the World Trade Center had been hit, and an hour and a half after the first multiple signs of multiple hijackings. We're told that this plane just waltzed into the most protected airspace in the world and hit the world's most protected building, the biggest military headquarters on the planet. This is already highly improbable.
Bottom line, in my professional opinion, based on my years of experience, my study of airline accidents and incidents, it's my opinion that a Boeing 757 did not hit the Pentagon. There would be an abundance of wreckage, and that the official sources have not been able to produce the evidence of any wreckage. Large tail sections, indestructible landing gear, indestructible engines, wing spars, fuselage, seats, anything of the sort indicates to me that a 757 did not hit the Pentagon.
In relation to the Pentagon, it's quite obvious that no Boeing 757 hit the building. There are multiple lines of reasoning that support that conclusion, including, for example, the complete lack of massive debris of the kinds and character that would be expected from a 100-ton airliner with a 125-foot wingspan and a tail that stands 44 feet above the ground. The hit point was only about 10 feet high and 16 or 17 feet wide on the ground floor. You find unbroken windows, undamaged fence, a couple of automobiles. What you don't find is massive piles of aluminum debris. You don't find the wings. You don't find the seats, the bodies, the luggage, the tail. Not even the engines were recovered, indicating that no Boeing 757 hit the building.
You've got a hole that's no more than 10 foot high and about maybe 15 to 20 feet wide that we're expected to believe a multi-tonned 757 jetliner with a wingspan of 125 feet and a tail height of 44 feet, that's 4 stories, folks, somehow managed to squeeze through this one little bitty hole in the ground floor of the Pentagon.
Before the outer wall collapsed, which was about 45 minutes after initial impact, there was only one hole, about 14 to 16 feet. And supposedly the 757 completely penetrated this hole without leaving any indication of where the wings would have penetrated. Adjacent to this hole, the windows were completely intact, and you can tell by the firefighters' foam that was sprayed around the hole and sticking to the windows. The windows are completely intact, both adjacent where the wings should have penetrated and knocked the windows out, and also directly above the hole where the elevated tail section would have penetrated. You know, the windows are completely intact.
I measured pieces of Soviet equipment from photographs. It was my job. I look at the hole in the Pentagon, and I look at the size of an airplane that was supposed to have hit the Pentagon, and I said, the plane does not fit in that hole. So what did hit the Pentagon? What hit it? Where is it? What's going on?
A Boeing 757 has a wingspan of nearly 125 feet, a length of 155 feet, and a height of 44.5 feet. As was reported, if the plane was flying over 500 miles per hour, common sense would dictate there would be some indication, any indication, of an impact of the tail section in the upper floors. In addition, the heaviest and most massive parts of an aircraft of this type would be the engines. If there were to be any holes at all, they would be located where the engines would have impacted the Pentagon. The ASCE in January of 2004 released its Pentagon Building Performance Report, and along with that, a video computer analysis of what happened when the mysterious Flight 11 supposedly slammed into the Pentagon. Let's take a look at the report. What significant information was overlooked in this video from the American Society of Civil Engineers? Well, first of all, the 18.5-inch steel-reinforced concrete wall was omitted. Secondly, you'll note that when the tail section enters the Pentagon, it remains intact. How is this possible that the tail section, over 44 feet in height, could have remained intact as it entered the Pentagon and left no entry point as is seen in this photograph? Thirdly, and most significant of all, is that this plane has no engines in this computer graphic model. Despite these omissions, the ASCE claimed that the plane took out 50 support columns. In this photograph, do you see support columns that have been destroyed? At the World Trade Center towers, we were told that the fuel fires burning from the planes were so hot that they melted steel and collapsed the buildings in a pancake fashion.
High up in both towers, the raging fires were now generating 3 to 5 times the heat of a nuclear power plant.
If this were true for the World Trade Center towers, wouldn't the same heat have been generated at the Pentagon?
When we look at the photographs on page 313 of the 911 Commission report, what we see is that to the north side, the left side of the impact area, that the walls on all floors are totally intact. The inner office walls are intact. We see no fire damage as evidenced by the books not burned, the computer intact, the other things in the office desk intact. So when we go back and see the official Pentagon performance report, it said that the aircraft sliced in, taken all of these wall structures, all these support beams. Well, the wall structures are there, the support beams are intact. So there again, the official report is contradicted by the photographic and video evidence.
Other than the 16-foot hole in the E-ring of the Pentagon, one of the most damning pieces of evidence to suggest an official cover-up is an examination of the official flight path of American Airlines Flight 77. The flight data recorder information recovered in the Pentagon wreckage shows the precise speed, altitude, and heading of the aircraft that we were told was Flight 77. If we examine the direction that Flight 77 took on its approach to the Pentagon, we'll note that the flight path is slightly different from that of the official report. This may seem insignificant at first, but how do we account for the light poles that were knocked down, even though they were not directly in the path of Flight 77? Secondly, if we take a look at the altitude of the aircraft, we'll note that mere moments before Flight 77 was to have impacted with light pole number 1 and light pole number 2, it was still 235 feet in the air. How is it possible that Flight 77 could have knocked over these light poles while it was at such a high altitude? Thirdly, if we take a look at light poles 3 and 4, we'll note that they are outside of the flight path of Flight 77 as well. How did these light poles come down? Following the flight path of the NTSB's model of the flight data for American Airlines Flight 77, we can see the flight path highlighted in red. Note that the plane passes over a light pole that should have been knocked to the ground, but remained standing after the event. What would explain this anomaly? Is it possible that the plane that impacted with the Pentagon was smaller than a commercial Boeing 757? After reviewing the photographs and the video footage taken at the Pentagon before the collapse of the outer E-ring, the experts that we've discussed this with, scientists, researchers, physicists, airline pilots, and military experts all agree that the damage seen is absolutely inconsistent with a 757 having struck the Pentagon. It is more consistent, however, with a smaller jet aircraft hitting the Pentagon, possibly a small jet, or a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, or maybe a Global Hawk missile. In this photograph that was taken at the Pentagon, we clearly see some sort of an engine rotor, but the question is this a rotor from a 757, a Rolls-Royce engine? Well, according to John W. Brown, a spokesperson for Rolls-Royce Engines in Indianapolis, he states it's not apart from any Rolls-Royce engine that he's familiar with. It's clear that there's been a concerted effort to cover up information, to distract, and to deceive the American people, and indeed the people of the world, as to what happened at the Pentagon on September 11th. With this in mind, is it not possible that those behind this conspiracy could have removed evidence that would have challenged the official story? And is it not inconceivable that evidence could have been planted to support the official story?
I know from my experience that it would have been highly improbable that even a seasoned American test pilot, a military test pilot, could have flown a T-category aircraft like the 757 into the first floor of the Pentagon because of a thing called ground effect.
The official trajectory has this plane just skimming the ground at about 500 miles an hour as it impacts with the building on the ground floor. That turns out to be aerodynamically impossible. Even a small plane, such as a Cessna at full throttle, would accumulate a packet of compressed gas, which is there beneath the fuselage, that would make it impossible for it to get closer than 15 feet to the ground. Discussions with aeronautical engineers have convinced me that for a Boeing 757 at 500 miles an hour, it could not get closer than 60 feet to the ground. If the plane had been taking the official trajectory, its engines would have been making massive damage to the lawn. Wake turbulence would have been wrecking it. The lawn would have been a mess. Instead, the lawn is perfectly smooth, green and smooth, which turns out to be, ironically, a smoking gun at the Pentagon.
Ground effect and the pristine condition of the lawn in front of the Pentagon aren't the only problems with the official story. The airline pilots that we talked with also have a very serious problem as to whether or not terrorists that were trained on small aircraft were even capable of maneuvering a large commercial airliner at such a high speed and making these very precise maneuvers.
I flew the two actual aircraft which were involved in 9/11, the flight number 175 and flight 93, the 757 that allegedly went down at Shanksville, and flight 175 is the aircraft that's alleged to have hit the South Tower. I don't believe it's possible for, like I said, for a terrorist, a so-called terrorist, to train on a 172, then jump in the cockpit of a 757, 767 glass cockpit, and vertical navigate the aircraft, lateral navigate the aircraft, and fly the airplane at speeds exceeding its design limit speed by well over 100 knots, make high-speed, high-bank turns, pulling probably 5, 6, 7 Gs, and the aircraft would literally fall out of the sky. I couldn't do it, and I'm absolutely positive they couldn't do it.
What's unusual about the 5 frames that the Pentagon released is they don't show a plane streaking across the Pentagon lawn. They just show a white vapor trail. The date and the time on the Pentagon frames is wrong. You know, at one of the most secure buildings in the world, and at the bottom of these 5 frames they have the word plane. It's like subliminal. You know, the word is there, but the plane isn't.
The Pentagon is the nerve center of the U.S. military. When it comes to U.S. security, all roads lead to the Pentagon. Surveillance would obviously be the first step in maintaining safety and security. Take a look at your local Walmart and count the closed-circuit video cameras surveilling the parking lot. Video cameras can be seen everywhere in our society. Are we to believe that the world's most secure building was only capable of capturing the event on video from 2 cameras at one location?
They took over the flight themselves and downed the plane in a field.
I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He's a photographer with the Pittsburgh affiliate of Fox affiliate. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. We could see some people walking around in the area, but from where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire, just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet.
In Shanksville, one of the things that's really remarkable is the Associated Press said that all the wreckage that was recovered from the whole scene could fit in the back of a single pickup truck and a few plastic bags. Now, there's just no way a big plane like that just completely disintegrates or reduces itself down to practically nothing.
The debris here is spread over a 3 to 4 mile radius, which has now been completely sealed off and is being treated, according to the FBI, as a crime scene. That's really all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris. There has been at least one report that the investigators out there, and there are hundreds of them, as I said tonight, have found nothing larger than a phone book.
There are lots of oddities about Flight 93. As Colonel Nelson has observed to me, it looked to him as though a bulldozer had been taken, a ditch had been dug that had been filled with trash and blown up. I had residents of the area call me to say that they told the FBI they heard an explosion in the air before they heard any impact with the ground, but the FBI refused to write it down. I have other residents of the area write me and explain to me they were taken to a search area far larger than the officially designated crash zone to look for body parts and aircraft debris, but told by the deputy sheriffs taking them that they would deny it if they mentioned this to anyone. I have a former Inspector General for the Air Force responsible for the conduct of air crash investigations tell me that if the plane had crashed as advertised, the debris should have been scattered over an area approximately 1 city block in size. In fact, it's distributed over 8 square miles, which is a scenario consistent with the plane having been shot down in the air, but not one that crashed.
Morning, Cleveland, United 93 is at good 350. Intermittent light stop. United 93 checking in 350. United 93 350, roger. United 93, that traffic for you is 1 o'clock 12 miles eastbound 370.
Well, I would definitely say after having looked at some of this video footage that I would have to remove myself from the quote believer category, and I can't say that I would be a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic, but there's enough information presented to cast some real doubt on the story as it's been presented, and with a lot of questions coming into my mind related to that. The Pentagon, along with Building 7 at the Trade Center, those two things are the biggest question marks in this whole scenario. I never realized that there was no evidence, if you will, of the tail section hitting the building in the Pentagon, or even of the engines. And all I've ever seen, like most of the general public, is a blurry image of purportedly to be a plane taken by a security camera hitting the side of the building, but so blurry that you can't really see what's going on. So yes, I would say, based on the photos I just saw, yes, I would have some real serious doubts and questions about the Pentagon story. There's a lot of information that's been manipulated and that we haven't been shown as a general public.
Caution. You are about to enter the no-spin zone.
Why did you have to tell him you were an atheist if you didn't have any trouble reading the oath? Why didn't you just shut up? What Jimmy Carter should do is privately give Mr. Bush's opinion and shut up publicly. That would be best for the country. And it is our duty as loyal Americans to shut up once the fighting begins. Me. Let's go. Okay. Thank you, Jamie.
I'm doing yes.
Good night. Thank you, Jamie.
Don't take your cheap little pathetic shot. I am telling you that that's
you're taking a cheap little pathetic shot.
On May 17th of 2006, the Pentagon announced that at 1 p.m. that day they would release new footage that they claimed would clearly show Flight 77 hitting the Pentagon. In anticipation to the release of this new footage, Kara Phillips on CNN interviewed Jamie McIntyre, who is the CNN senior Pentagon correspondent. During this interview, Kara Phillips asked Jamie McIntyre what his thoughts were on some of the ideas that something other than Flight 77 had hit the Pentagon.
Having been there on September 11th, having seen the plane wreckage and photographed it myself personally, I can tell you that that's nonsense. I had a camera with me. I took pictures of some of the wreckage. some of the parts of the fuselage, a part of the cockpit, until they told us we had to move back away from the scene.
After hearing Jamie McIntyre's statements with Kira Phillips in this interview, we couldn't help but realize that they were inconsistent with his original live report at the Pentagon on September 11th. Let's take a look and listen carefully to what he said on that day.
From my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual site of the building that's crashed in, and as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon.
After realizing the blatant contradiction of Jamie McIntyre's statements on September 11th and the statements that he had made on Kira Phillips' interview, we decided to put out a news release on May 18th. In this news release, we quoted Jamie McIntyre's statement on September 11th and the statements that he had made on Kira Phillips' news broadcast. As a result, I received a phone call from CNN's Headline News. I was invited to be a guest on the Glenn Beck program, which is aired daily on that channel. They had asked me to come on the program to discuss some of the controversies and conspiracy theories about what had happened at the Pentagon on September 11th. Now, realizing that despite the fact that they were very friendly and professional on the telephone, this was not going to be a very friendly interview. Let's take a look at this interview, and you decide whether this is journalism or propaganda.
Conspiracy theories, sure, they're fun. They help us keep that dream alive that someday we really will walk on the moon, and that next Christmas, your stocking could be stuffed with an Elvis comeback album. Actually, some aren't so fun. Ever since 9/11, a bunch of theorists, otherwise known as people with active imaginations, no common sense, and a lot of time on their hands, have insisted that explosives inside the World Trade Center brought the towers down, that all the victims in the first plane really didn't die because there were no passengers, and that no plane ever hit the Pentagon.
Ask yourself this question. Does this sound like an introduction for an investigative piece of journalism with an honest desire to get to the truth? Or does this sound more like an ad hominem hit piece with a design to discredit and ridicule the messenger rather than address the issues and the evidence presented?
There's a documentary you can't get off of you can get off of a website, but for some reason they're not letting you buy it at Blockbuster, and now available is a director's cut that insists all of it is a hoax. Dave von Kleist, you produced it. Tell me, sir, how is this not a plane? Right there. Can we freeze that and show that box? How's that not a plane? That's a big white object of some sort. That's right. It's either a plane or a naked Michael Moore headed for the buffet.
Glenn Beck, you're absolutely right, and you've just proven my point. This photograph does show something. It's either a plane or a naked Michael Moore heading for the buffet table, but it could also be an A-3 Sky Warrior jet or a Global Hawk missile. The fact is, this photograph shows something, but it proves nothing.
And yet, Jamie McIntyre on CNN yesterday stated that he had photographed pieces of the cockpit and the fuselage, and Jamie McIntyre also stated on September 11th that upon his close inspection, there were no pieces of recognizable wreckage from any type of a large aircraft. He stated that there was no fuselage, there were no wings, no engines, nothing that you could recognize as a large aircraft.
What's in Area 51? Is it aliens or office supplies?
The desperate attempt to somehow link me to aliens, an Elvis comeback album, a two-nosed Osama, and Area 51 is nothing more than another example of how ridicule and condescension are utilized in a last-ditch effort to somehow draw attention away from evidence and information that is damning to the conventional wisdom of the official story. Now, many of the Glenn Beck listeners may have bought into this ploy, but to those with the ability to recognize it, it was nothing more than an assault on the evidence and information and an insult to the families who lost loved ones on September 11th. Jamie McIntyre appeared on Anderson Cooper's 360 program in what appeared to be a damage control interview. Obviously, he was responding to our news release and my appearance on the Glenn Beck Show. He was claiming that statements he made in his report on September 11th were taken out of context.
The websites often take statements out of context, such as this exchange from CNN, in which I, myself, appear to be questioning whether a plane really hit the building.
From my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon.
In fact, I was talking about an eyewitness who thought the plane landed short of the Pentagon, and went on to say the only crash site was at the Pentagon.
The only site is the actual site of the building that's crashed in. And
in fact, there were thousands of tiny pieces of the plane, and I personally photographed a piece of the fuselage and what appeared to be part of the cockpit.
And now let's listen to Jamie McIntyre's live report again on September 11th.
From my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual site of the building that's crashed in. And as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around.
It appears that the only person taking Jamie McIntyre's statements out of context is Jamie McIntyre.
And I think we need to make explicitly clear who she is embracing. There are only two websites that deal with 9/11 that she has linked to on her own blog. One of them is called WTC7, and the other one is the Scholars for 9/11 Truth. These are the worst, most fringe, kookiest, discredited academic crackpots who believe that the Secret Service and the CIA planted a controlled demolition of that building. And if Rosie really wants to have an honest discussion and debate, I dare her, I dare Barbara Walters, I dare ABC to put on the editors of Popular Mechanics to set the people straight about what exactly happened.
Popular Mechanics magazine published this article in their March 2005 edition. It was entitled Debunking the Myths of 9/11. And in regard to what they reported at the Pentagon, they stated, when American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon's exterior wall, Ring E, it created a hole approximately 75 feet wide, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers Pentagon Building Performance Report. The exterior facade collapsed about 20 minutes after impact, but ASCE based its measurements of the original hole on the number of first-floor support columns that were destroyed or damaged. Let's back up. The article states, when American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon's exterior wall, Ring E, it created a hole approximately 75 feet wide. But according to the photographs and the video footage taken before the collapse of the outer ring, it's clear to see that the hole certainly was not 75 feet wide. It was the collapse itself that created the 75-foot wide hole, according to the photographs and video footage that was shot before the collapse of the outer ring. And yet the Popular Mechanics magazine doesn't mention the collapse as occurring until 20 minutes after impact. So how can it be both ways? Either Flight 77 hit the Pentagon and created a 75-foot wide hole, or it didn't. The photographs and video footage clearly show that there was no 75-foot wide hole and that the collapse itself created the hole that they're referring to. This type of reporting is disingenuous and misleading, to say the least. And at this point in time, James Meigs, the editor of Popular Mechanics magazine, has refused to debate or discuss this issue. One of the most controversial and divisive issues in regard to the quest for truth about what happened on September 11th is the issue as to whether or not there was any extra equipment attached to the belly of the plane that was reported to have been Flight 175. The Popular Mechanics magazine of March 2005 quoted their expert, Ronald Greeley. He was the director of the Space Photography Laboratory at Arizona State University and is an expert at analyzing images to determine the shape and features of geological formations based on shadow and light effects. Greeley dismissed the notion that there was a photo that revealed a pod. In fact, according to Popular Mechanics magazine, the photo reveals only the Boeing's right fairing, a pronounced bulge that contains the landing gear. Greeley concluded that sunlight glistening off the fairing gave it an exaggerated look. However, on the Art Bell show, Ben Chertoff, who was the science researcher for Popular Mechanics, was interviewed.
If you actually
actually watch the footage in full motion, you can see most of it is just the shadow from the engine as it's flying into the building. But when you see it on the video, there's this enlargement effect that happens from the video, and that has turned into this pod.
Question: how could the pod have been created by sunlight, according to Ronald Greeley, and shadow, according to Ben Chertoff, at the same time?
The most valuable commodity to a newsman is his credibility. And I don't take lightly investigating what happened on 9/11, because it could end up being one of the biggest crimes ever perpetrated in American history.
We've seen several examples of how the media has massaged, manipulated, and created stories to mislead the American people and the people of the world. The BBC reporting 25 minutes before it happened that Building 7 had collapsed. This despite the fact that never in history had a steel structure collapsed as a result of a fire. And yet they reported it before it happened. How did they know? We've seen Jamie McIntyre reverse his own testimony that he gave on September 11th, claiming that those reporting had taken his words out of context. We've seen Glenn Beck utilizing propaganda techniques in an attempt to discredit and ridicule and negate real information. We've seen ABC TV in New York City interviewing William Rodriguez on September 11th of 2006, where they took his testimony where he described the explosion below him and made it sound as though he was describing the explosion of the plane hitting above. Ever since September 11th, talk show hosts on radio and television have discussed these events, some supportive and some challenging the official story. There are those, however, that utilize what some call thug journalism, a technique of talking over, ridiculing, discrediting, and insulting the guest in an attempt to make them look silly. Let's take a look at an example of thug journalism at work. In this example, Bill O'Reilly on The O'Reilly Factor was interviewing Professor James Fetzer, who challenges the official story. We timed this interview, and in this 6-minute and 20-second television piece, Mr. O'Reilly talked for 5 minutes and 1 second, where the guest, Professor Fetzer, only spoke for 1 minute and 17 seconds. The concept of host versus guest seems to have escaped Mr. O'Reilly. In real journalism, a host will ask a question, and the guest is allowed to respond. At that point, the host can engage the guest in a conversation and a debate of the issues. This was certainly not the case in this interview with Professor Fetzer.
You're like the guys who think that the space aliens kidnapped Elvis or something like that. That's where you are. You're nuts. We're both entitled to our opinion, okay? So you're entitled and I'm entitled. And we'll let the folks decide. Well, hold it. You hate your country.
The American government.
Look, you hate your country. You're accusing a man of murder, the President of the United States, of murder without any evidence.
Bill, you're obviously not going to give me a chance to talk about any of these things.
No, I'm not, because you're a nut.
Go to our website, st.
All right, we heard your website.
If you want the truth.
Fine.
Bill O'Reilly shouted over, interrupted, attacked, ridiculed, and insulted Professor Fetzer at every opportunity in an attempt to take away any credibility that Professor Fetzer may have had. This is not journalism, but it has, however, become standard operating procedure on many talk shows. Those that do have evidence and information that challenge the official story are very rarely allowed to present that information. There has to date been no open and honest discussion and presentation of evidence and information that challenges the official story. It seems that the only ammunition that these talk show hosts have is to insult and ridicule the messengers because they desperately want to avoid the evidence and the message itself. In this video documentary, we've heard from experts and seen video footage and photographs that challenge whether or not the planes that hit the North and South Towers were actually commercial aircraft. We've seen video footage and photographs and again heard from experts that challenge what happened at the Pentagon on September 11th. We've seen video footage and reporters' accounts of what happened in Shanksville, Pennsylvania in regard to Flight 93, the fact that there was no recognizable wreckage and a crater only 15 feet across. We've also examined video and photographs of the collapse of the buildings in New York City. We've seen how the mainstream media has twisted, distorted, and fabricated information. We've seen how they've attacked, ridiculed, demonized, and discredited anyone who dare challenge the official story of September 11th. With all this information that challenges the official story, we have to ask the question, is there any evidence that supports the official story? On September 23rd of 2001, Condoleezza Rice held a news conference, and she stated, "We have definitive proof and evidence that links Osama bin Laden and the Taliban to the attacks on September 11th, and we will release this information in due time." At the date of this production, we're still waiting to see that evidence. In October of 2001, this video was released and shown to the people of America and the world, and we were all told that this was Osama bin Laden accepting responsibility for the attacks on September 11th. But let's compare the Osama in this video to a photograph of the known Osama. When you compare the two, you'll notice that the Osama in the video has a shorter nose. He also appears to be a little chubbier. As the Osama in the video waves his hand, look carefully. You'll see he's wearing a ring and a wristwatch. Jewelry is forbidden by people of the Islamic faith. You'll also notice that when he signs on this pad, he's signing with his right hand. We know that the real Osama was left-handed. So we have to ask this question, where did this video come from? And why was it fabricated to mislead the people of America and the world? If you visit the FBI.gov website, you'll find the 10 most wanted list. And on that list, of course, is Osama bin Laden. You can pull up his wanted poster, and on that poster is a list of charges that he's wanted for. The curious thing is that nowhere in the list of charges is any mention of September 11th. The Muckraker report contacted Rex Toome, a spokesperson for the FBI, and asked why was there no mention of the attacks on September 11th on Osama's wanted poster. Mr. Toome's response was, "We have no hard evidence linking Osama bin Laden with the attacks on September 11th. Condoleezza Rice had stated that they would release their information in due time. Ladies and gentlemen, when you charge someone with conspiracy to murder 3,000 people, and you have no evidence to back up that charge of conspiracy, that makes the charge a conspiracy theory. That means that the entire war on terror is based upon fraud. We've been told over and over again that this is a war on terror. But is this a war on terror or a war for profit? We know that there are hundreds of government contractors in Iraq right now with countless contracts. Let's take a look at one of these government contracts, a no-bid contract that was awarded to Halliburton. The Houston Chronicle reported that 82,000 gallons of liquid propane fuel were to be transported to Baghdad. But they weren't going to be transported from the United States to Baghdad. They were going to be transported from Kuwait to Baghdad, a distance of approximately 300 miles. I contacted a liquid propane company and asked how many trucks it would take to transport 82,000 gallons of fuel. I was told about 10 trucks. I asked, how much would you charge to transport those 10 trucks approximately 300 miles? I was told approximately $1 per mile per truck, for a total of approximately $3,000. I asked if this was a government contract, how much would the charge be? And I was told that it would be 2 or 3 times that amount. So let's say it would be $10,000. The question is, how much was Halliburton awarded to transport this fuel? The answer, $27.5 million. How many of your tax dollars went to pay Halliburton to transport this fuel? Wouldn't it have been cheaper to have 10 privates drive those trucks that distance? The question is, how much money is coming out of the United States taxpayers' dollars to pay for this war and is being funneled into the pockets of companies like Halliburton? Is this a war for profit? You decide. After reviewing the video and photographic evidence, the number one question that people ask is, well, if the plane didn't hit the Pentagon, where did it go? If the plane that hit the South Tower wasn't Flight 175, then where did it go? Where are those people? Well, we can't answer that question, and if we were attempting to do so, we would be engaging in conspiracy theory. However, consider the following scenario. Let's say that you have to put a loved one on a bus bound from New York to Boston. You put them on a Greyhound bus, and off it goes. A couple hours later, there's a news report that claims that the Greyhound bus bound from New York to Boston skidded out of control, crashed, and exploded. A couple weeks later, someone who happened to be sightseeing with a camcorder shows up with a videotape of the event. And upon examining that video footage, we see that this bus says Trailways on the side. Question: where did the Greyhound bus go? Well, if your loved one was on that Greyhound bus, you'd want to know, wouldn't you? The next question is, should we ridicule and demonize anyone who dares ask, where's the Greyhound bus? Should we likewise ridicule and demonize the person who took the video? Should we negate and ignore the video footage of the Trailways bus simply because we don't know where the Greyhound bus went? Well, that's exactly where we are in regard to the video footage that you've seen. We may never find out what happened to Flight 77 or Flight 175, but the video and photographic evidence screams that we need a new investigation.
Dear brother, can you help me find my way? I seem to lost my way. Please, brother, dear brother, can you show me right and wrong to help us get along?
I would like to have every American get serious about being a citizen of the United States of America instead of just being an inhabitant, and start thinking on their own, because 9/11 is the single most important event to happen to the United States since Pearl Harbor.
For those people who question 9/11, who maybe support the work that the 9/11 truth community people have produced, for them to lift their voices. This is supposed to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. Let's be brave. Let's get involved. Lift your voice.
We can't let this stand. We cannot move forward. We have to leave a legacy of the Constitution, our rights, our Bill of Rights, everything for our children. Even if we don't get to enjoy it in our own lifetime, we have to fight for it.
There is some suspicion that what hit the trade centers may have been military planes. Might not have even been the flights that we were told. Of course, this raises up the horrific idea that, well, then what happened to the poor passengers? It's one thing if they were killed as collateral damage in some sort of attack, and it would be a totally different thing if they were landed somewhere, offloaded, and then just cold-blooded murdered. The problem is we don't have the answers to all of this because there's never been a truthful investigation.
I would like to see another investigation. I don't know if I could go with another official investigation. I think we've come far enough, all the people who have gotten involved in the 9/11 truth movement. They may not be able to come up with a definitive story of what happened, but I think we've got enough evidence to demolish the official story. And if that's the case, we need to continue. What was the aim? Why are we in the Middle East? Why did they use 9/11 as a pretext, a false cause and a lie to get us involved in the Middle East? We need answers to these kinds of questions.
The 9/11 Commission report, it's the biggest insult and slap in the face of the American people that has ever been offered anywhere by anyone. This, David Griffin called it a 571-page lie. He said there isn't a word of truth in it, and he's absolutely right, because truth depends on context, and the entire context that's created in that book is myth, and more myth. That is sacred story designed to influence people's social behavior and their idea of themselves in the world, but it has nothing to do with fact. Myth can be true. Not all myths are false.
If we're going to continue to call ourselves a free and democratic society, there must be answers, there must be accountability. Somebody has to be held accountable for what actually happened on 9/11.
Ladies and gentlemen, justice must be served. The investigation into the attacks on September 11th must be reopened, and the evidence presented in an open and unbiased world televised trial, so that those guilty of these crimes be brought to justice, and let the punishment fit the crime. So what else can we do? Well, the answer can be seen in our founding documents. The Declaration of Independence states, "But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security." But let's be clear. No one wants to overthrow the government or abolish the Constitution. It was Abraham Lincoln who said, "We seek not to overthrow the Constitution, but we seek to overthrow those who would pervert the Constitution." We call on all those in uniform that took an oath to support and to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic, to do just that. We call on all those in law enforcement to protect and serve the people, not those who pass laws that destroy our way of life and criminalize the very activities that make us a free society. Our unborn children will either curse our complacency or they will applaud our activism. The world is watching what we do and what we don't do. The choice is yours. Either we resign ourselves and our posterity to a world controlled by those that would murder, deceive, and enslave us, or we rediscover our heritage, reaffirm our patriotism, and muster the courage to do what we know we must do. If we don't, we never again will be able to call ourselves the land of the free and the home of the brave. We can do it. We must do it. And we will do it. I'm Dave Von Kleist.
There's a million reasons why I don't believe it. There's a million reasons why it can't be true. Open fire can't melt steel. It's not hot enough. It's nothing new, it's not a mystery. Check out the Reichstag, Germany. There's a million questions still remain unanswered. There's a million questions still to be resolved. Out of 19 Muslim guys, 7 still remain alive. It's nothing new, it's not a mystery. Check out the USS Liberty. 9/11, 9/11. What went down with Building 7? It's a mystery to this day. The building fell with such precision. Free fall speed, no reasons given. Like the towers, it just fell. Fire's not enough. No way hard enough to bring it down. The project for the new American century was added to a year before that day.
Back in 2004, I got permission from the DoD to go on Whiteman Air Force Base and do some shooting and some interviews. Quite honestly, I don't think they'll ever let me back on that Air Force Base again, and here's why.
This is the primary anti-armor round that we use. It's called the depleted uranium.
The total amount of munitions that we covered in the time our unit was there would probably cover by a couple of layers at least 2 to 3 football fields.
The giant munition you see behind me is the GBU-37 5,000-pound bunker buster.
You deal with military situations, you're away from your family, you're on your own.
In Gulf War I, our military reported in some cases that they were ill within 48 hours. And of course, they had no idea that they were using depleted uranium weapons and certainly were unaware of the harmful effects.
We got sick immediately. Rashes all over their bodies.
Brain damage.
And we were all just exhausted. Excruciating headaches.
We had no protection.
The president lied. And really what we are victims of Desert Storm.
The civilian population will continue to be exposed to increasing levels of DU internally. In fact, depleted uranium is a death sentence.
Individuals are depleted uranium casualties, whether they're civilians or combatants.
These people in the Department of Defense are lying, not only to the troops, they're lying to the whole world. They're trying to pawn off our nuclear waste as an appropriate mechanism for a military arsenal. What's important for people to know is that the United Nations has declared this weaponry illegal. And it's important for us to be in receivership of this, to be in receipt of the fact that we are using an illegal weapon. We are breaking the law. If the law doesn't matter and good science doesn't matter anymore, then what does this country stand for?
We don't want your Iraq war. We don't want your Iraq war. Bring our troops back to our shore. Bring our troops back to our shore. Am I right or wrong? You are wrong. You're wrong. You are wrong. You're wrong. Tell George Bush we will not stand for this anymore.
On crimes against humanity committed by the Bush administration of the United States.
How dare we torture and murder? How dare we have secret prisons? How dare we hold people indefinitely? How dare we do these acts in the name of freedom?
When I was young, my teacher told me that I was free. Yeah.
The American public was basically manipulated into this war.
I feel like I was used as a pawn by this government in their imperialistic policies. I feel like I was sent there just to secure oil for industrialized nation run amok. I feel like I was just used and betrayed by my government.
58,000 of us didn't make it back from Vietnam, and now 3,000 aren't making it back from Iraq. It's time to find a better way.
Bush and everybody in that administration needs to go and needs to go on trial, and we need to change this nation for the better. And we all need to find what's common with our causes and get together.
It's called voting, and if enough people will turn out and vote for a third-party member, we can get rid of the Republicans and the Democrats, who both represent the same corporate interests, and we can get a third-party member in there who will actually represent the will of the people.
Together, we're going to take this country back to the people. Thank you.
Washington, for the death of my comrades in arms, for the lies that you told this country, for your negligence in Katrina, for your wastefulness in spending, for the lack of jobs that are in this country right now,
you're fired.